Hello, this is Voxel and welcome to part 3 of this video series. So here I am inside After Effects and we are ready to do the compositing part now. So I will right click inside my project window and choose import file, and I will go over to where I rendered all of my passes. So here we have them: fire, logo, mesh, particles and reflection. So let's just start with fire and we're gonna import all of them. You can just select one frame and make sure PNG sequence is enabled, and if you hit open it will import as a frame sequence, and then you can place it as a layer in a new composition. So for example, I can grab the fire layer and I will place it inside the new composition, and then it just creates a new composition with all of these settings, so 30 FPS and 1080p. So that's just an easy way to get started with the project. And I will also drag the logo now, and you can also just simply double click to import. And here we have our mesh, our particles, and finally we have the reflection. Alright, so let's place all of these layers. Alright, so here we have all of our layers, and before we actually do anything with these layers, I want to set each layer up in their own composition. So I will select the fire at first, and I will press Ctrl+Shift+C, and this will just make a new composition. Basically it just puts the layer inside the new composition. Make sure Move All Attributes is selected, and I will name this to fire, and I will do the same for the rest of these layers. So I'm just pre-composing my layers, particles, and lastly we have reflection. Alright, so let's see. We want the first layer to be the logo layer, and then all of these layers I will set to blending mode screen. Alright, and you can see because of the blending mode is set to screen, then they all kind of blend together, with our logo being the base layer. And let's create a background now. So I'll press Ctrl+Y, or you can go to layer, new solid, and this will be my background layer, and I will place this below our logo. And you can see here that our logo, I actually forgot to render it with alpha transparency, and an easy fix for this is if I go back inside my Cinema 4D file. I actually don't need the dragon surface, so I will hide this, and for my logo, this extrude part over here, I will go in the compositing tag that we've talked about in the previous part of this tutorial series. And here we can activate matte object, and I will set the color to be white, 100% white. And now if I make a quick render preview, you can see this renders out as completely white, and we can use this layer as an alpha transparency map. So we want the background, this black background for the logo, to be transparent, so we can actually add our own background. So let's go back here, and if I press Ctrl+B, I can save this new pass as an alpha pass. So here we have our render passes, and I will rename this new folder to alpha, and now I can go ahead and render this. Alright, so now back inside After Effects I can import my alpha pass. I will double click to import this, and actually I will go inside the logo composition, and I will drag my alpha pass over here, and I will rename this to alpha, and then I can set the logo to be luma matte of the alpha. And now if I enable transparency for the preview, you can kind of see now it's completely transparent, the black is gone, and we can add our own background. And in case you don't have this option over here, press F4, and this will change up the option so you can choose luma matte. Alright, let's go back inside our fire composition, and I will actually go to composition settings, and I will rename this to, let's see, main comp. Alright, so now if I unsolo this, you can see now the background, the white background shows. And let's go ahead and add a generate ramp to this background layer. I will set the ramp to be linear, radial, sorry. And for the first color, I will choose sort of like a blue, and the second color will be dark, completely black. And let's adjust the colors a bit. Maybe sort of desaturate this blue and make it darker. So maybe something like this. I think this is fine. And let's choose a preview. Let's choose a frame over here so we can get started with our color correcting and so on. So the first layer I want to take care of is the logo. So I can go ahead and actually solo this, and I will add a color correction, curves, and first of all I just want to darken out my shadows a bit and maybe increase the highlights. So this is on the RGB channel, and let's go ahead on the blue channel and increase the blue shadows maybe. And let's go ahead on the red channel and actually decrease the highlights, and this will just give the logo sort of like a bluish with a slight highlighted green color, which will complement the fire's orangey and red look really well. So I think I will leave the logo like this for now, and let's take a look at the fire. Let's solo this. So watching this, I can't really tell much about what's going on over here around the head area, and I think that's because the fire is too bright. So let's actually solo this, and I will go ahead and add another curves to this. And right away, maybe I want to work this unsoloed, so I want to see how the changes we make affect the whole look, and maybe decrease the highlights a bit. And I will keep the values up for the shadows, for the darker parts. And let's get rid of some of this green. So I will just grab my green channel, just sort of get rid of the green, so it's a bit more transparent. Let's take a look at the red channel. Maybe we can increase this and give it a nice sort of a red tint, kind of fire. Right, so I think I will leave this like this. And I also want to add a effect stylized glow to this, and I will increase the glow radius and decrease the threshold. So we're just sort of creating a very subtle glow around the fire, and this should be good for now. Let's go to our mesh, and I will actually solo this, and let's go ahead and start with the tritone. So I will select for my tritone mid color, sort of like a base color from which we can sort of start color correcting. I just find it easier to start with a basic tritone as a base color and then add the curves and work from there. So you can see now if I add the curves, we can instantly create some nice yellow highlights and some dark reddish tint. And I can go to the separate channels over here and affect all of the channels individually. So maybe increase the green highlights and decrease the green shadows to get some more of the red on the darker parts. So I think something like this should be fine. Let's unsolo this, and this seems to be alright. And let's actually disable my reflection, or actually I will leave the reflection as it is. Let's go back to our mesh over here and maybe just slightly increase the highlights. And I will also add a glow to this, and I want to increase the radius. Let's decrease the intensity and decrease the glow threshold, or rather increase. Let's take a look at another frame. So I think this is looking pretty fine. Let's actually see if we can get the fire highlights to be even lower. So I will go to my green channel and decrease it. And let's go to my red channel and maybe even decrease the red channel a bit. Or actually I will leave the red as it is. So I think this will be fine for our fire and mesh layers. And now we can take a look at our particle layers. So I will solo this, and actually I want the particles to be set to add, and this will make them pop out a little more in the overall look. And I want to start by soloing this layer and adding a tint, and I will use the tint to give it a base color. So I will choose like an orange. I think this will be fine. And right away I want to add a curves adjustment, and let's increase the highlights, and maybe make this tint a little more towards red, so maybe something like this. And let's add a glow to this, and let's decrease the glow threshold and maybe increase the glow radius a bit, so something like this. Let's see how this looks. Alright, not bad. I think actually maybe the glow is too high, and also the curves, so I will adjust the curves a bit. I don't want the particles to be this noticeable. Let's take a look at a few more frames. And also right away, right over here at sort of like the end, you can kind of see the particles are starting to act really chaotically, and we can actually just fade out these particles layers. If I press T and then set a keyframe for opacity and move a few frames forward and then set the opacity to 0, you can kind of see we're just really easily fading them out, because we don't actually need to see them on this close-up shot over here. And let's try to do a little cool trick. I will duplicate these particles, this particle layer, and I will solo this, and I will reset the tint, or actually I will just delete it. So I want the particles to be white, and I will sort of crank the contrast by using this curves adjustment, and I'm sort of trying to filter out some of the more bright particles. And now if I unsolo this, you can kind of see we are adding some variation to the layer, to the particles layer, and maybe we can even increase this contrast even more. So now if I turn this off, you can kind of see we have some nice variation in the particles. So some of the more brighter colors will be more towards white, which will just create a more interesting effect. And maybe our base particles layers is still a little too noticeable. And let's take a look at our reflection layer. So I will add another tritone to this, and let's solo this actually, and I will make this a little more orangey. And now I will add a curves and increase the contrast. And I want to add a glow, and I will decrease the threshold, maybe not that much, and then increase our radius. And if I unsolo this, let's see how this affects it. So not noticeable enough from what I can tell. I will actually increase this curves RBG scale over here, and I will actually set this to add maybe, and maybe increase the radius of decrease the threshold of the glow, so the colors pop out a little more. So maybe something like this. And now we have our reflections layer, and everything seems to be working fine. Alright, let's see how we can add some ambient particles, and for this I will actually use Trapcode Particular. So I will make a new layer, name this particles, and I will go add a Trapcode Particular. And for emitter, I want to set this to be box, and I want to set the velocity and all of these the velocity settings to 0. And now I can just increase the size X, Y, and Z for this emitter. And here's the problem. the particles aren't really following the camera because there isn't a camera. So remember when I said that we have to export our camera. Now we can import the camera data from Cinema 4D. So in the last lesson, I've shown you how you can save the camera data from Cinema 4D and export it to After Effects by going inside the save file and then to Compositing and include 3D data, and then you can save project file. So this will save the file as a .aec file, and you can then import this by hitting open. And here you will get a new composition, and inside it you can see we have our camera and the light even, but we only need the camera for this. So I will Control-C this, and I will exit the reflection and also the logo, and I will Control-V this, so I will paste this inside the new scene. And now you can see if I solo the camera, the particles follow the camera from Cinema 4D. And now I can go in my particles layer and I can readjust some of these settings based on the camera. So I will actually zero this position X and Y, and this will center it in the middle of our scene. And you can kind of see the particles are forming over time, and I actually want them to be already formed at the start of the project. So I can I will actually set the particles per second to be maybe 5000, and then set a keyframe and move a frame forward, and then set this another keyframe for 0. And now you can see I'm generating the first frame 5000 particles, and actually 5000 particles per second. It's not really per frame. So I'm generating a bunch of particles and then stop generating them the next frame, and this will just sort of give us some particles to work with. And you can kind of see they're disappearing, and that's because we have to go to particle and increase the life. So I'll give this a life of 5, which is the length of our tutorial. And I will actually move this layer one frame ahead of time, so it actually starts at the first frame with all the particles being generated. And let's take a look. And I actually need to set this to 5.1 to sort of compensate for the offset frame. And this looks fine. We can adjust the particles now. Let's set the size random to be maybe 65%, and also opacity random I'll set to be 50%. And let's unsolo this and see how it looks. Alright, so maybe I can use a little more particles. So let's go back and let's use maybe 3 times as many and offset this frame again. Alright, so this looks slightly better, and we can just give the particles some slight velocity. So I want some movement on the particles. It just creates a more interesting effect, and I will set the size to be 3 because they were a little too big before. And for the color, I want to set them to be sort of like a dark orange. And let's actually add a glow to this. And usually what I like to do with spark-like particles, I will add a glow and immediately I will duplicate this glow by pressing Ctrl-D. And now this second set of glow, I can decrease the threshold and increase the glow radius a bit. And I can set the particles to add. And I will actually duplicate this layer of particles. And I want to set this new layer of particles to emit 3 times less. So I will divide this value by 3, so 5000. And what this will do, basically, if I solo both of these layers, you can kind of see that a third of the particles will sort of glow a little more because of the duplicate. So you can kind of see the effect. And I will unsolo both of these. And I think maybe I will set the original particle layer to be a size of maybe 1.5. So I don't want them to be too noticeable. I just want them to add a little bit of detail to the atmosphere. And I will also set the second layer to a size of 2. So maybe a size of 2 is too little, maybe 2.5, or actually 2.75. Alright, so I think this looks fine, and let's render a RAM preview and see what we get. Alright, so I'm actually happy with this result, and we can go ahead and take care of the last part, which will be the sort of like the title reveal at the end over here. And let's get started with that. So for our last composition, we will be needing sort of like this shockwave element or explosion fire reveal thing. And this is similar to the Shockwave pack from VideoCopilot, if you're familiar with that. So it's a really simple setup, and I'll show you how to do it in a few steps. So I will make a new project, and let's create a let's actually start by adding a container, a TurbulenceFD container, and let's add a torus object, and I will scale this down and try to fit it inside the container. And let's actually grab our TurbulenceFD container and decrease the scale. And while I'm here, I will set up my simulation cache folder. So I will go to my sims folder, and let's take a look at the torus. Let's set up a frontal camera. So I will add a new camera, and if I go in the camera view, I can set the rotation to 90 and -90, and this will sort of give it a frontal angle. And I will set the X and let's see, the Z coordinates to 0 and 0. And now we sort of have like this camera front view, everything is centered and positioned properly. And let's actually increase the Y value, or actually decrease, so we sort of zoom in. And let's press Ctrl B and set my render settings to be 1920 by 1080. So this will be our full HD resolution, just so we have an idea of how this render will look and fit inside the comp. And let's try to fit in our camera, and I will make this torus object smaller maybe. And this torus object will sort of work as the object from where the flames are emitting. And I know I also want a sphere object, and I will scale this down. And this sphere object will work sort of like a collider for the flames. So this sphere essentially will keep the center hollowed out, because we don't actually need any flames in the center. So I will go ahead and add a TurbulenceFD emitter for the sphere, and I will set this to be a collision object. And now I can right click this torus and add a TurbulenceFD emitter. And I want to use one temperature value and one fuel value. And this will be fine. And let's go back in my TurbulenceFD container, and let's go to simulation, let's go to fuel and make sure this is active. And I want to animate the expansion of the fuel, and I will start by setting up the expansion at a value of 12 and make a keyframe and move forward maybe, I think 10 frames will be fine. And then I will set this to 0 and then another keyframe. So this will sort of make our flames sort of explode from the center. And let's make sure our turbulence temperature, actually I don't need any buoyancy for this, so I don't need the flames to rise up. And let's set up some initial turbulence intensity. Let's go maybe with 20, and for smallest and largest I will use maybe 2 and 12. We can go back and change these. And I also want some vorticity, so maybe a value of 3, and vorticity will just sort of amplify the curls that the fire creates, and this will just create a much more interesting result. And we can take a look at the base render now. So let's go to our simulation tab and let's hit start, see what we get. Alright, so not bad, I think. Maybe actually this is not bad, but maybe the expansion is too high. So I will go back to my expansion and set this to 10. Set the keyframe, and let's see what we can do over here now. Let's go to our torus object, and I also want to animate the values for fuel and temperature. And I will set a keyframe at frame 0 for 1 and 1 and move forward to frame 10. and set these to 0, set the keyframe. And let's actually just increase the voxel size maybe a bit, so 0.7. The final simulation will be maybe something like 0.25, but now we're just trying to preview our simulations. Alright, so actually not bad. We can hide the sphere and the torus, and let's play this back. So pretty good. I think the expansion can still be set to a lower value. So going back in my simulation tab, let's set the expansion to maybe 8. And I also know I want to animate the timing for this. So I want the time scale to start maybe at a value of 250. Set the keyframe and then go forward to frame maybe 15 and set it back to 100. So let's preview this now. Alright, so getting slightly interesting, more interesting results, but actually I think the expansion was was sort of better at 10. So let's reset the keyframe to 10. Let's preview this now. And this is pretty fine. Let's actually just increase the dissipation for my temperature, and I will increase the cooling to maybe 15%. Let's actually increase the expansion even more. Let's try a value of 15 and see if we can get a bigger explosion. Alright, so now that I've increased the expansion value, you can kind of see now we're creating a much bigger explosion. And essentially I'm just trying to sort of fill out the entire screen. Let's actually grab a random frame over here and make a preview render of this, so Control R. This looks actually not bad. Let's preview this. And I think this will work actually. Let's actually just set up the higher resolution simulation and work from there. So I will use a voxel size of 0.25 or maybe even 0.2 centimeters, and I will check cache velocity, and now I will simulate this. Alright, so we've finished simulating, and this is the result. And let's preview a few frames over here. And pretty clean, pretty smooth. And let's actually just preview, render a preview frame. So Control R. And this looks alright. Let's actually go in our rendering tab, and for fire shader, or actually before that, let's go in our viewport, and I will set the shader to be fire shader. So now we can kind of see the adjustments that we're gonna make. So in our rendering tab, under fire shader tab, under mapping, I will go inside this mapping curve over here, map editor, and I will just sort of readjust these points a bit for this curve and see how we can get a more interesting result. So Control R this, and now we can see we're getting a lot more detail. We are having some interesting highlights, and it's a lot better than the original curve. Let's preview some other frames. And this seems to be actually fine. We can also do some adjustments inside After Effects after we render this. And let's take a look at adding some subgrid detail and velocity displacement. So if I make a preview frame render, so I'll render out a normal frame without any velocity displacement. And then if we add the velocity displacement, let's see how that changes things up. And let's try a value of 5. Preview again. Let's make this full screen, and you can see already that we are creating some really kind of more realistic flames. I would say we are having a lot more detail, and it's just an overall way better result. As you can see, this kind of looks all blurry and not that high quality, as opposed to having some velocity displacement. So you can kind of see for a few seconds increased render time, you'll get a much better result. And let's preview another frame. Let's preview this frame with velocity displacement. So this is how it looks with velocity displacement, and if I turn this off, if I set this to 0 and render a frame now, you can kind of see it has a huge difference in the overall quality and look. So that's just something to keep in mind with velocity displacement. I always use this velocity displacement for all of my simulations and most of my projects. So I will set this back to 5, and I think we can go ahead and actually render this out. So Control B, select all frames and save. I'll just save this into a new layer. I'll save as a PNG without any alpha, and I'll set up my folder and then render this out and export it to After Effects. So here I am back inside After Effects, and we can create our text composition. So I'll go to Composition, New Composition. Let's rename this to second comp. And I want to make this also 150 frames duration. Hit OK, and let's import our wave. So I've saved the render as a wave, and this is the name that I gave it, but you can give it whatever name you want. And I will now click and drag this wave into the comp. And I want to go back into my main comp over here, and I will select the background layer and both of these particle layers, and I will Control C, and then I will paste them inside the second comp, and I will place the background below the wave. And the wave I want to set to add transfer mode. And let's take a look. I actually want the wave to offset a few frames here, so I will just drag it over to the left, and I sort of wanted this composition to start with the wave sort of over here. So this will be my this will be how the composition starts. And let's actually add a color curves adjustment to this. And I will increase the contrast a bit, and I want to get rid of some of this green, and this will just make it overall a little more red. And maybe we can even increase the red channel. And let's take a look. So this is fine, and I will press S for scale on this wave layer, and I will set the keyframe, and then I will go maybe towards the end and set another keyframe for the scale, maybe around 200. So you can kind of see now I'm scaling up this fire layer, and it just sort of gives the feel that it's pushing outwards a little more, and that's a little more realistic. And I also want to fade this out around here, so I will press D for opacity, set a keyframe, go towards the end, and set another keyframe for 0. And this will just sort of fade out my wave layer. And we've imported the particles from the first comp, and these particles seem to be working fine. And I also want to fade these out maybe, so I'll grab both of these layers and press T, and then just maybe fade them out towards the end. So make another keyframe for 0, and now the particles are fading. And let's actually add our text now. So I will type my text, and I will grab this text, and with my selection tool selected, I will hold Control Shift while repositioning this, and this will sort of snap it towards center. And let's take a look at what we can do with the text. So with my text selected, I will add a generate ramp, and I will just offset these points a bit, sort of create like a nice gradient. And I also want to add an effect, perspective, bevel alpha, and this will just sort of give it a nice sort of like a 3D beveled look. And seems to be alright. Let's place it below our wave, and I will fade this in as the wave fades out. So I will press T for scale, for opacity, sorry, set another keyframe here, go towards the end, and set a keyframe for 0. So now the text just sort of fades in. And I also want to add a distort turbulent displace effect to this. I will set the amount, I will leave the amount to 50 and set the size to maybe around 8. So you can kind of see it's creating this interesting distortion that will sort of match our flames motion. And I will set a keyframe for amount at 0 around this place. So if I press U, you can kind of see we're showing all of our keyframes. And now if I go to maybe around this place, I can set another keyframe for the amount. So I will have this start around this amount at frame 11, frame 11, yes, and just animate this text in. And I will also set a keyframe for evolution by using an expression. So I will hold Alt selected. I will hold down Alt and select stopwatch for evolution. And now I will type time multiplied by 150. This will also just sort of animate this turbulent displace effect even more. And I want to add another effect to this text layer, and I will go to blur and sharpen and add a fast blur to this. I will set the fast blur to be maybe 20, add a keyframe, and then go towards the end and set the keyframe for 0. And now we're kind of having this text animation. And let's actually go to our fast blur, and I will set the initial keyframe to be maybe less blurred, so I'll use maybe a value of 14. So this seems to be fine for now. And let's see, let's add a final adjustment layer to this. And I will use a effect stylize glow and increase the radius, decrease the threshold maybe, and decrease the overall intensity. So just adding some glow. And let's actually create our final composition now. Let's create a new comp. And let's name this final. Let's make sure both of our comps, so the main comp and the second comp, will fit inside the duration. So I will set this to be 300. Hit OK, and then I can drop my main comp and then our second comp. And I sort of want to match these end beginnings, sort of synchronize the comps. And let's actually render out this transition part, just this part over here, and see how this how these two comps transition into each other. So I will make a quick RAM preview. Alright, so let's take a look. So not bad actually, and there's a few things we can do now to make this transition just a little more smooth. And I will actually add a new adjustment layer. So go to layer, new adjustment layer, and let's see, I want to add a curves adjustment to this. So add a curves, and I want to set a keyframe for, and I want to raise the contrast of the RGB scale. So I will just increase the brightness, and I will set the keyframe. And if I press U, you can this will show us our keyframe information. And I will go to maybe around this spot over here, and I will press reset, and this will just add another keyframe with its original value, and you can kind of see it just brightens this up. And then I can go forward a few frames and also set another keyframe for its original value over here. So now we're just sort of creating like this flash in between the compositions. And I also want to add a, let's see, a camera lens blur. So I will set a keyframe for maybe 35 around this spot where the transition happens, and I will check repeat edge pixels, and I want to go towards where our original curves keyframe is, and I will set a keyframe for a value of 0, and then another keyframe for a value of 0 over on the other side. And let's take a quick RAM preview now. Alright, so you can see now that with the curves and the camera lens blur adjustment, we're kind of creating a more smooth transition between these two compositions. And with the camera lens blur, it sort of seems like as the dragon comes towards the camera goes out of focus, and then it refocuses on the second part of this video, and it just creates an overall smooth transition. And actually, I will choose a frame over here. And one final thing that I want to say is if you add a new adjustment layer, I have an effect called RSMB, And this is a really cool effect to sort of simulate motion blur. And you can see right away, if I add this effect and I turn this off, you can kind of see that it creates some nice motion blur. And I really recommend if you can get your hands on this plugin right here, so RSMB. It will really help if you work on high velocity animations and overall character animation. It just makes life a lot easier without having to render out motion blur from Cinema 4D. And you can kind of see instantly, you just add the effect and it just works with very few settings to actually have to deal with. So I will make a final render preview for this and see what we get. Alright, so not bad, and with this we've concluded the final part of this tutorial. So hopefully you've enjoyed this tutorial and maybe you learned a few things or two. If you want to see more tutorials, you can check out my website, voxel.com, and I also have templates and also free templates and downloadable content, so definitely check it out. So thanks for watching so far. Don't forget to subscribe and like the video for more tutorials, and I will see you next time.